Hi guys, welcome to the Lunge and Lift podcast. Today we are rejoined by a very special guest, Mr. Luke Hall. So over the last month, I've been running an experiment with Luke. We did a test of my Vo2 Max and other things, and we go through the results of the first one and apply a very targeted intervention. We'll go through the details in the episode, which was horrific. Some of the worst training I think I've ever consistently done. And then we go through the retest and see what's changed. And there's some really surprising results out of it. It's not what you might have expected, but we did learn a lot, and we're excited to share the results with you. But before we get into it, as always, a big thank you to our show sponsor, Wit Fitness. Please check out the website at wit-fitness.com and use discount code LL15 to get 15% off your purchase. Right, let's get into it. Luke, welcome back to the show. Thanks for coming back, mate. How are you today?
Thanks for having me back, guys. Yeah, I'm good. Good to be back. I'm excited to talk through the torture that we've put you through for the past kind of 4 weeks.
Yeah, finally making it all worthwhile. So maybe I'll give a quick summary of where we are and what we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail. So I did a test with Luke. It's a Vo2 Max Test, but it's so much more than that, which we'll go into in the discussion. And it's important that we understand that it's a lot more than that. And I'll let Luke talk through the protocol first, and then we'll go through what happened.
Ace, yeah. So the test that we carried out was on an assault bike, the most fantastic bit of kit going, but ultimately the most sport specific to the kind of training that Ash has been doing, and obviously to CrossFit training as well. The test is called a 3-1-3 step test, literally just because that's the amount of work that you're doing. So 3 minutes work, 1 minute rest, and 3 minutes of the same work, and another minute of rest, and then we take the intensity up. And so we take that intensity up linearly after those 3-1-3 segments to essentially max to failure, till in that minute you can't go any more. And so the reason that we have the little rest period in there is ultimately so that we can look at blood flow between work and rest. So when there's tension being applied by the muscle, how that affects blood flow, and when it's released, what happens as well. 3 minutes, it's basically been developed from a 5-1-5 test, which is quite a traditional test. The reason that they use 5 minutes is ultimately so that in each rest period you reach homeostasis. Essentially, we know that kind of immediately upon work we see Ash use oxygen, but the supply of oxygen to kind of meet that increased work capacity takes however many seconds, minutes to kind of level out. So you want to get to this point of basically steady state within that work period. We took it down from 5 to 3 because we found that you didn't necessarily need 5 minutes to reach that steady state. And also in terms of time domain, most CrossFitters are not going to be spending 50, 60 minutes on an assault bike, which would then be what the test turned out to be. So it makes it a little bit shorter, a little bit more relevant to the time domain of CrossFit, but we still get that kind of steady state aspect of it, which is what we're aiming for within each work period. But yeah, and then we throw in afterwards, mostly because we're sadistic, a 30-second sprint test at the end. So when you reach failure within the 3 minute segments, you get 3 minutes rest, and then you've got to just sprint on the assault bike, max calories, no pacing, no holding back, for 30 seconds. And I say it's because we're sadistic, but it's also just to make sure that in terms of oxygen saturation and usage of oxygen at the muscle, we've kind of bottomed out there as well, because you will bottom out quicker with a higher intensity. So if we can do that over the 30 seconds to see where we get to, compare that to the 3 minutes, it's like, oh yeah, hang on a minute, Ash did reach his max intensity, he did bottom out, or I know maybe he didn't because he's managed to get a little bit more out there in that 30 seconds.
Brilliant. And I think if you haven't listened to our first episode we did on this test when Rob and I both did it, scroll back and check that one out, and we go into a little bit more detail on the kit. I think the really cool part of this experiment for me is the Moxie monitor. So it's a little device you stick on your thigh, and it basically tells you how much blood is arriving at the muscle and also how much oxygen is in the blood. And that was really the key for me to understand what was holding back my performance. And we'll dig into exactly what that means. So, Luke, can you tell us a little bit more about the data that came out of the test, please?
The test and the retest, we comparing it both. Sweet. So obviously we look for kind of Vo2 max, and the reason that it's so much more than a Vo2 max test is with the Moxie and the other measurements, we're allowed to kind of see the limiters to that Vo2 max as well. So in terms of thinking about oxygen and the way we use it when we exercise, there's kind of three systems at play. You've got the consumption of oxygen, which is that lung capacity, that Vo2 max. You've then got delivery of oxygen to the working muscle, which we can see using the Moxie, as Ash has said there. So it looks at total hemoglobin at the working muscle, and so if that increases, it's an increase in blood flow for whatever reason. If it decreases, decrease in blood flow for whatever reason. And then we're also able to see the oxygen saturation at the muscle, which is a sign of utilization. So we see how much is being used and the supply and demand there. So are we diving straight into the results of pre and post? Are the metrics of VO2 heart rate, saturation, and that?
Let's go chronological. So we'll do the first test, and then we can talk through the intervention.
Fantastic.
So why we did what we did.
Okay, so the first test that we did, thinking about the context of those three limiters, first things first, we found that Ash's VO2 was pretty high. It was nice. It was up at like 56.
Better than last time, right? Better than the very first time.
Yeah. So this is to preface that we've done three tests now, really. One before that was a different, and then this was the first kind of step test that we did, and 56.6 milliliters per minute per kilogram. So amount of oxygen that he's pulling in per minute per kilo body weight, which will be important later because he's put on a few pounds. Well, 1 pound. So VO2 nice and high. We also saw in that first test that his blood flow was relatively consistent. So we look for kind of hemoglobin trends when we're looking at blood flow. And during the work period, what we tend to see is total hemoglobin drops compared to rest, just because of the compression from the muscle, essentially just squeezing the blood vessels a little bit. But that's normal to see. That's not necessarily an issue. It only kind of is flagged as a bit of an issue from a delivery point of view if, whilst in that work period, we see hemoglobin increasing, which is the sign of a little bit of occlusion. So where the tension in the muscle is so great that it's essentially preventing blood flow away from the muscle, and it's just pooling there, which obviously kind of leads to a little bit more buildup of waste products, that swelling in the legs. And we didn't really see that across the whole time. So Ash's blood flow delivery for the first test, really, really nice and steady all the way through. So looking at that, we're thinking, okay, consumption, he's got a big old lung capacity, 56.6, happy days. Blood flow looking very nice and consistent all the way. The thing that we found was ultimately when Ash reached failure on this test, his oxygen saturation, so measure of oxygen available at the muscle, was 52%, which is huge. That basically means hemoglobin at the muscle, half of the hemoglobin molecules there still had oxygen attached, ready to be used and not used for whatever reason. And he failed with kind of a load there still to be used. So from that, it was pretty simple to see, hey, Ash, hang on a minute, your ability to use oxygen at the muscle could be better, could be a little bit better, and thus, hopefully anyway, your performance would increase. So limiter being utilization there on that first test.
Great. And I think one of the things that's worth mentioning is that my performance was measured as how many intervals I could make it through. So as the target power, which we used RPM as a proxy for, how high could I go and still hold the intervals? And I basically tapped out, I can't remember how many it was. We did 50, 55, 60, 65, and I just got into 70 for maybe a minute, and then I couldn't hack it anymore and tapped out. So that will be important later on.
There we go. Yeah.
So now we know what my limiter is. What did we do about it? Let's start nutritionally.
Okay, good, because that's my cup of tea. So from the nutrition side of things, the first thing that I always look at with this is ultimately, okay, what needs changing at the physiological level to improve this limiter? And so when the usage of oxygen is a limiter, there's kind of two things that we want to change: efficiency of mitochondria at using oxygen, and then also potentially your ability to deal with waste. Because what can happen with a buildup of waste products, so hydrogen ions, carbon dioxide, is they essentially change the ability for oxygen to be released from hemoglobin. So if the situation becomes more acidic at the muscle, hemoglobin will hold tighter to oxygen and won't let it go, won't let it be released. And so from a nutrition point of view, we're thinking, okay, cool, how do we slow the acidity? How do we delay that buildup of waste products so that theoretically oxygen can be dissociated and used a little bit better? And immediately beta-alanine to mind. So beta-alanine, for those of you that don't know, is essentially an amino acid, and the way it works, when it combines with another amino acid, histidine, it produces a compound called carnosine. Carnosine is a buffer. So essentially what that means is when we train super hard to produce kind of lactate and hydrogen ions. These hydrogen ions are what kind of change the acidity of the muscle and create that fatigue. Buffers like carnosine and lactate even, they basically latch on to the hydrogen ions, and that basically just takes the acidity of the muscle down. And so the more carnosine that you have, the more buffering of an effect, and the longer kind of it takes to fatigue, and theoretically the harder you can go. So with beta-alanine, what we did is just supplemented with, I think I gave the range of like 3 to 6 grams, didn't I, per day? So what was it, 5 grams per day for yourself, Ash?
Yeah, a heat scoop.
There we go. 5 grams per day for about 4 weeks. And with beta-alanine as well, it's key there to say that it's consistency, because you're trying to build up the amount of carnosine at the muscle. So if you take it once, you'll feel the tingles, and psychologically you'll think, oh yeah, it's working, definitely. But it definitely takes that longer period of time, so 4 weeks, to actually build up the carnosine and get those benefits out of it.
It's something like creatine then. It's just that thing of more longevity, of taking something consistently to building up your stores, rather than, as you say, just a one-time hit thing and expecting the benefit from. So
exactly that.
Yeah, so I did get the face tingles, and the thing that's quite nice about beta-alanine is it's not actually a stimulant. So days when I forgot to take it during the day or before training, I could literally take it before bed, and once you're used to the tingly feeling, it's not a big deal at all. You're just going to make sure you get it in. I think I probably missed one day out of the month, so was pretty diligent in all situations there. And then maybe I'll go through the training intervention. So with the consultation with Luke, we came up with a protocol twice a week, just because I've got other things to do than sit on an assault bike. And the first session was the worst one and some of the worst training of my life. It was 3 sets of 30 cals all out, and then rest basically as necessary to be able to give it another good effort again. And the reason it's 30 calories is we needed a duration of time that would really empty my tank, and anything shorter than that wouldn't put me in that state. So, and the reason it needed to be all out is to create, we were talking about it before the call, it's almost like a downward momentum of oxygen. So you're very rapidly deoxygenating the blood, whereas if you go at a more sustainable pace, you actually can hit equilibrium and you're bringing in oxygen as fast as you're using it. So it's important that the intensity is really, really high. And I'd say I was doing them at 95%, because you always psychologically hold a little bit back when you know you've got 1 or 2 more. And it was absolutely horrendous. I've got to say that there's one session when I literally couldn't get back on the bike because I had to work afterwards, and it's horrific when you can't stand up. Like my legs would get so full of acid that I literally couldn't be on my feet because my knees would buckle, and I would really need, like, the first one I could probably rest 10 minutes, 12 minutes and get back on, and the second one would be all right. But the gap between the second and third one, even in the final week, it was 20 minutes before I could even psych myself up to actually put any force into the pedals, because if I got on any sooner, I know I wouldn't have had any power to drive the bike. But that's the training stimulus that we're trying to elicit. So that's kind of what's necessary for this protocol. So even though total work would have been about 3 minutes, it was a really brutal session to do, even though you're just standing around for long periods of time.
On that, it's really interesting, because I think this is the essential part of that necessity. You're training for the specific stimulus so that you're after, because most people's training, they won't allow for, say, essentially what you said, 3 minutes of what, how many minutes of work did you just say?
3 minutes.
Yeah. So 3 minutes of work, right? In an hour, say, potentially, right? Yeah. So if most people would think, I'm only going to train 3 minutes, they're like, I've got to do other things. Whereas you had that very particular session, say, right, this is all I'm going to do, and you was okay with that. And I think because you had the goal of improving, and you had the specific, like, what you needed to do to achieve that, I think that was key. And I think for to carry us over to the general public is in like, if you have a limiter like what Ash had there, to be okay with only doing 3 minutes of work in an hour, because you know you're getting better. If that was your goal is to get better, then that's fine. But I think for most, to do a 3 minute session in an hour, it might not be the most conducive of their time if they can only train a few times a week. So
yeah, there's a lot of sessions I've done that have lasted an hour long that have been nowhere near as tiring. So if I think it's the quality over the quantity of that one. And like you say, getting that stimulus, that's what sort of I had in the back of my mind on the bike. So it has to really suck, otherwise it's not actually doing what we want it to do. There's no point me doing it 80%, 85%, because then I just wouldn't get that oxygen as low. So that was session number 1. And then the second session was one influence from Luke's endurance training of past, which was also unpleasant, but I would say not quite as unpleasant, where we'd do 10 rounds of 1 minute work, 1 minute rest on the assault bike at a challenging intensity. But the kicker here is that in the first 30 seconds of rest off the bike, I would sit in the bottom of a squat to basically trap the acid in my legs. So my body was forced to learn to deal with the waste products that have built up during the interval. And the first time I did this session, I paced it completely wrong, went out way too hard. And I had that exact same feeling of my legs just couldn't put out any power. So I actually had to tap out. I think I did 3, then missed an interval, 2, then missed an interval.
I was there for that session. I remember seeing you do it. Yeah, I remember seeing that one.
I'm sad I missed it now.
It was, But then once I sort of found my pace, I knew what sort of RPMs I could hold for each interval. And the next 3 weeks, I steadily added a little bit to each one. And actually in the final week, obviously I've practiced it 3 times previously, but also in my head I'm thinking the beta-alanines had this effect. I had my best performance in the last week, and my legs actually felt the least burn, and I wish I'd pushed harder, because I added 5 calories to the total calories for the session and felt like I probably had 5 or 10% more in me compared to even just the week prior. So it was really cool to just see my performance increase quite significantly, as well as the subjective feeling of the workout over quite a short period, with only, if you think about it, 13 minutes of work on the bike per week. And I felt quite a significant improvement.
Did you, so what was your RPMs, just to give our listeners a bit of an idea? Because obviously it's relative, and obviously it's a big difference, but what was the RPM you failed at in the first week, and then where did you find you got to in the second week that you felt, okay, this is it, and started to increase, and where did you finish thinking you could have gave more?
So the first week I came out the gates at about 85 RPM, which which then dropped off quite quickly over the subsequent intervals. Even within the interval. In the second week, I did about 68, I'd say. So I basically went 68, 70, 72, 73 in those 3 weeks. And the fourth week when I did 72-ish, I felt like I could have done a bit more, actually, because I finished that one, sat in the squat, got out of it, and was like recovered in a few minutes. Whereas the week prior, doing 70 RPM, the last 3 or 4 intervals, I was really having to dig to actually complete them at that speed.
So it's fascinating because, like, when I think back to like EMOMs and stuff like that, I know if you've got a 15-calorie EMOM to hit in a minute, you essentially go out the gate hard and then settle into around, say, 71. That will kind of get you to 15 calories in 45 seconds. So did you, for that 4 minutes of work, did you go out hard and then settle in, or did you kind of ramp up to 75 and then settle in?
No, I'd get the bike going as quick as I could
Cool.
when the minute started. So I'd give it a little, 2 or 3 strong pumps on the handles, and then settle in. And that's sort of I don't want to jump ahead, but one of the factors that we need to consider is that I just got better at using the assault bike through the month, because it's not something I do a lot of in my normal training. So the skill component and the practice side of things will have improved my performance to a small degree as well. People don't think there's skill in the assault bike, but there actually is. So.
Oh, massively. People don't understand the pull factor, just using your arms more. And that's the thing, especially, which is why I think it's such a beautiful bit of kit, as Luke said at the start, to use for CrossFit, because a lot of CrossFit is so total body that this is a bit of kit that just ends you, because it's so across the board hard for everyone, because everyone can push effort, and it's an effort-based machine, and that's what's so good about it. So what was one of the hardest things you found in those 4 weeks to be consistent with? Because obviously you said it was hard to train. So that first session is always that dread, but you always made sure, and you were really consistent with the beta-alanine. Is there anything else in that month that you found got affected, or like maybe your like capacity to work, as you said, was affected after one of the sessions? Not necessarily that session was bad, but did you find any other struggles or any other benefits in that month?
It was just the recovery post session. That first session, I would need like half an hour just to come back down to earth, and some sugar like quite quickly, just to feel like I could be a normal human again. But other than that, I think I was reasonably disciplined in that I got both sessions done every week, and
Did you feel
no
fitter?
dramas really? I definitely felt fitter on the bike, although I probably did less other cardio in that month than I was doing before that, which is another interesting thing that feeds into the results. But I mean, like that last workout in the 10 times 1 on 1 off, I felt much fitter than I had done in the previous weeks.
Great. So to the retest.
Tell us about the retest results,
please, Luke. Okay, cool. So starting off with the one that everyone cares about, that ultimately everyone should probably not care about too much, Vo2 Max. So interestingly on this one, and obviously we're going to contextualize it, in the first test you hit a Vo2 Max of 56.6 milliliters per minute per kilo. In this test, you hit a Vo2 Max of 53.9 milliliters per minute per kilo. Obviously all that work for a drop in your Vo2 Max. In terms of contextualizing that, obviously Vo2 Max is measured per kilo body weight, and as we said before, Ash was sitting a little bit heavier this time in, so that has kind of changed the figures there. But what we've done to kind of account for that is also attack just an absolute Vo2 number. So taking his body weight when we did the test before, times it by the Vo2 Max there to give an absolute number, and then the same for this test here. And so absolute VO2, just the amount of oxygen he could consume, the maximum amount, 4.69 litres in the first test, 4.53 litres in this test. So 160 millilitres less this time, which in the grand scheme of things is not a huge amount, negligible really. So it's one of those where I would personally say that that's likely no real change in aerobic capacity and oxygen consumption there. But what are your guys' thoughts?
Yeah, I think, well, 160 mils is less than half a can of Coke in terms of volume to visualize, which is a nice way to frame it. The other thing that's important to note, it's the peak. Is it the peak or is it the average of how high I got in terms of
the peak?
It's the peak, yeah. So that means in the first test, at a point in time, I was bringing in that volume of oxygen, and in the second test, at a point in time, I was bringing that oxygen. That doesn't necessarily mean that's actually, because it wasn't the thing that made me fail. Then potentially there's more there. Am I just trying to salvage something from this, or is my interpretation correct there?
Yeah, potentially it's an interesting one. So yeah, it's important to there, like you said, just clarify a couple of terms. So I've used them in poorly so far. So VO2 peak is kind of what we're going off here. So VO2 peak is just that absolute maximum value, and then you've got measures of kind of VO2 max as well, which is more sustained value here, and in this they're very, very similar. So I think VO2 max is always going to be slightly lower, but they were very similar across both there. And with VO2 peak, like, it'll change dependent on the bit of kit as well. Like, you'll see some people that can get a higher VO2 peak on a treadmill than on an assault bike for whatever reason. Could be because of opening up of the diaphragm, more used to kind of breathing whilst doing that motion as well. Yeah, there's a lot of factors that could have fed into that, but because it is such a small difference across both, with an extra kind of little bit of weight as well, it's likely no change. As I say, that's my thought anyway, is you've definitely not improved on your VO2, but you've probably not got worse either.
Can we just state the amount of weight you put on was 600 grams. So this is less than a bag of sugar. So just it does make a difference. I appreciate that, but I'm sorry. I thought it was a joke when I saw this in the notes, right? So because 600 grams for me, it's like, that's me waking up and not going to toilet time. That's 600 grams, mate. I'm like, that's not really weight. So, but yeah.
But again, like, it's important
it
to
does
say that
make
as well,
a difference. I know it does.
But even if we did this test at a different time of the day where Ash weighed a little bit less as well, that's going to change the VO2 peak per kilo. So that's why it's nice to have the absolute measurements to compare between as well. Definitely.
Yeah. One thing that's probably relevant for this and also the other points is that let's do the performance. So in terms of performance, if you remember from the first test, I tapped out after 1 minute of the 3 minutes at 70 RPM. In this test, I completed the whole 3 minutes and then tapped out during the rest. And there's a couple of...
Sorry, what? You tapped out in the rest?
Want to go back.
So there's a couple of talking points around this, in that one, I thought I had smashed my previous score, so I was happy, and Luke asked me the question, which is, I'm not blaming you whatsoever, this is entirely on me, but giving me the option of, like, do you want to try the next one? No was the answer. I didn't want to try the next one, but I probably could have done a bit of work. I'm not saying I would have completed all 3 minutes of it, but in terms of going to absolute failure, I should have restarted the second interval of 70 and gone until I actually couldn't hold the wattage. That would have been the right way for me to go through the test, which also potentially explains why I didn't stretch that VO2 to absolute failure. The other point to note is that in the first test, I threw up afterwards. In the second test, I didn't. So that suggests that
you did disappear, though.
Yeah, I thought about it. I went to make a prayer to the porcelain god. But yeah, nothing. There was no purge. So
it's interesting, though. Sorry, just on that, the fact that you chose not to go, because I'm not going to say there's a pattern, because on the very first one you did, you blamed Luke as well, because you said Luke said something and you thought, oh, I'm done now, and then you tapped out there.
Exactly.
But
no, it is a pattern.
It's funny that because in the middle one, so the first one at the start of this, obviously you didn't get that option, so you just knew you had to go in. So it just shows that it's not always about performance. It is just that it's the influence, and that's not, there's nothing against Luke or anything. It's like, it shows that there's so many factors to achieving a number beyond just what you can do. Because if there was someone else next to you doing the same test, you're going to have that little bit more urge to push or hold in that little bit longer and stuff. And that's why in competition, it's amazing that next level you can go to, because you can lift that extra bit of weight or hold on to it for a little bit more. So it's a very fascinating study that you chose to pull out in the rest?
Yeah, I think it's a really important point actually, because the psychology of pushing to failure, it is really tough. It is really uncomfortable, and the common theme between the first and the third test, where I thought I had succeeded. So my target for the first test was to get over 50, and Luke called out 50 because I hit that as my peak, but I didn't hold it long enough for it to actually be my score. So I thought I'd done it, and I was like, right, I'm happy with this now. I can leave it. And in this test, I knew I'd smashed the power output and performance side of things, because I know I did the whole interval at 70. So I thought I was well ahead. And Luke's a super encouraging coach when you're doing something like this. There's loads of positive chat. So I was thinking, I've absolutely nailed this. Like, the data must be amazing based on what he's saying. And then when I was offered the option of ending in the interval, I was like, yeah, I feel like I've pushed myself hard. I think I've already succeeded. So knowing that I've got this 30 seconds max effort to come, my psychology was that I'd rather save a bit. Yeah, exactly. Whereas had that not been on the table, I probably wouldn't have done it. And that's, no criticism of Luke in any sense.
Well,
but it's
for me, I think I need to explain why that option was on the table in the first.
Yeah, please do.
Well,
please do.
And
This
it
is
was
the self-defense, right?
It's one of those things where, like, I have the luxury of in front of me seeing the data, right? Seeing the trends in blood flow, seeing the trends in oxygen desaturation, seeing the trends in VO2 as well. And ultimately, in that last interval, your VO2 peaked about halfway through it in that 3 minutes that you got through, and then it just sort of stayed, it plateaued essentially. And so if that was still rising all the way through those 3 minutes, there's no way I'd have given you the option to tap out, because it was still going up. So it was one of those where it's like, hey, there's probably more in the tank. Let's see if we can take it a little bit higher in the next one. But the fact that it had kind of plateaued, breathing frequency had spiked as well. So it was almost kind of like a hyperventilation situation.
You read the signs. You already knew what was coming, because obviously Ash was in the thing. Because I think this is, as you say, that this is a really important point, because I remember from coaching and stuff, or even with clients, and when they're going up in weight. So I had a prime example the other day with my client. He was bench pressing, and so he wanted to hit a certain number, and say he was at 97 kilos and grinded it out, right? And he wanted to hit, he said, if I hit 100 for the day, I'll be happy, right? But he goes 97 kilos, and he grinded it out. So in my head, I know he's not going to get much more than 97, because once a bar path starts to slow down, so you just know. And he goes, right, I'll go 102. And I was like, okay, so then it's already he's gone above his 100, and he said, 102. So I said, okay, cool. So I took the weight, so I've started to put 100 on. I said, you want 102, yeah? And he goes, yeah. I was like, okay. So as well, because I knew I was there, put it on, and again, it's that thing. I gave him the option, but I saw the signs. I already knew he wasn't going to hit it, and if he did, he blew my mind, but he didn't, and that was a thing. But this is exactly that. So that's from strength training to then, as you said, I can read the results as they're coming, because I'm not the one in the thick of it. And with Ash being in the thick of that and having the option, he's like, I probably can't get much more out. Fuck it, I'm not going to do it. And then, because I've got the 30 seconds to still do it at the end. So it's interesting.
So the difference between Rob and Luke is that Rob will let you
as long as you don't hurt yourself. Yeah.
Okay, great. So we've got VO2 is slightly worse, performance is significantly better, and what are the other aspects of the results, please, Luke?
Yeah, so let's go straight on to the main one, shall we? The big one that we were aiming to improve. So obviously the first test, the muscle oxygen saturation bottomed out at 52%, so plenty of oxygen still to be used. This test, you managed to desaturate the muscle to 26% muscle oxygen saturation. So literally 26% improvement on last time to end up at 26%, right? So essentially your ability to use oxygen improved, definitely. So if we think about it through those systems, the trends in blood flow did change slightly at the end, which we'll get to, but thinking about VO2 as about the same or maybe a little bit worse, you're still bringing it in, but you're using more of what you're bringing in now, which is likely what led to obviously the increase in performance there too. So a success, I would say, because that was what we were targeting. It was very targeted approach as well. Like in a larger training program with more kind of things factored in, it's likely that you can improve everything as you go. However, I think it was such a big limiter before that it's good that we've done this now and brought that kind of up your ability to use it so that everything is round and about at a similar level now. When you think about your consumption, your delivery and your utilization, there's no standout like, oh, that could be better. It's all like, okay, sweet, now we can just take everything up.
So with Ash's, obviously the amount that he's got left in his muscle, what would be the reality of getting it down to? What's the furthest? Because obviously you're not going to go down to 0. So what kind of number would for Ash to be super specifically fit at this particular utilization? What would you say if he done like another 4 to 8 weeks of this?
I'm not doing another 4 to 8 weeks.
It's just, but the reason why I ask is because I'll be so curious if you did another 4 weeks and what kind of improvement it would be, because you've now got the improved skill of the assault bike. You have a better understanding of yourself. So the next 4 weeks would be how much would he improve again? Not by 26%, but where would you predict? And what
maybe you should do this one, Rob.
Do you know what? No, I'm genuine. It's like, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking about it, because I love, just after doing a little bit of the competition you have down in the assault bike, it brought back the fire of that pain of the assault bike that I love. And I was just like, I do wonder, because I've now moved to more powerlifting for the time being, it's like, I love that intense. I want part of my training to be that high end stuff. So you having 26%, what would be a good place to go to after that he'd probably get to?
So it's all context dependent, right? And the beauty and kind of annoying thing about it as well is when we're looking at muscle oxygen saturation, there's no standardized values across different sports. We can apply kind of logic to it. So an endurance athlete, we wouldn't want to desaturate by a huge amount because we want a consistent kind of flow of oxygen through there. In my experience testing kind of high level CrossFit athletes, I'm able to kind of draw comparisons between how good they are at CrossFit and what they do and where they sort of bottom out. And the kind of threshold that I've put on it, and this is, as I say, a threshold that I've put on it. It's not a standardized kind of threshold for different sports or anything like that. It's just based on what I've seen and how that reflects in performance in the sport. Sub 20% tends to be sort of where these guys are at. Anything kind of below there, obviously, as you say, Rob, you don't want to go all the way down to 0 because there's always going to be oxygen pulling in, right? You don't want to have no oxygen at the muscle. But that kind of sub 20% seems to be a good, almost a balance. Like we think about CrossFit in terms of good at everything and that balance across it. And being able to desaturate to 20%, maybe not all the way, obviously, while still obviously having solid blood flow all the way through, and a good solid Vo2 Max and Vo2 base tends to kind of be where I'd aim for. So with Vash, it's like, is he going to the games? Probably not. So 26%, I think we can be happy with that, and no need to really target it anymore, or not target it as intently as we have done. Like it can still be something that's built into a more complete, well-rounded training program there. Yeah, definitely. So
it's that classic 80-20 rule, right? It's that 80-20. Just what you want to get down to around that 20%. So that's good, mate. 26% is a great place to get to.
Well, I was just going to say, at the rate I improved this month, I'm improving by 26% a month, so I would be at 0 if I did it for 4 weeks. I probably shouldn't.
You should probably stop now then. Don't want to get too good.
No. Great. So there was one more point, was there, Luke? You said about the blood flow, or no?
Yes. Yeah, blood flow. So interesting. So like I was kind of saying before, in the first test with Ash's blood flow, in the work periods, we saw really steady kind of hemoglobin trends, which is just a sign of consistent blood flow, which is good when you're supplying oxygen there. What we saw in the later intervals in this test was in that work period, blood flow started to kind of climb up. And that can be due to a couple of things. It could be because of kind of increased CO2, which is a vasodilator, which could just result in like systemic increase of blood flow. But it's more likely because of kind of how acute it was to be a case of a little bit of venous occlusion occurring. So the tension from Ash's muscles causing a little bit of restriction and causing blood to pool at the muscle in those work periods. And it could potentially be, and I'm saying could, I'm always going to say could, because you're able now to apply more power, ultimately engage more muscle tension. And so that increased muscle tension is creating that occlusion, which is what's leading to that pooling. But obviously that increased muscle tension is also creating more power output and the ability to kind of keep going and achieve higher. So quite an interesting one there. Again, it's expected to see, you expected to see some form of occlusion towards the higher end, because it shows that, yeah, you are going hard. There's a lot of muscle tension there. What we sometimes see, and I say sometimes, what we saw in me anyway, was like even in the first steps, we saw like occlusion, and it was my blood flow was not good. Just too much muscle mass on my legs, basically, inhibiting that blood flow. So, which, as I say, at the lower end becomes an issue because you're much more likely to get waste product buildup earlier and fail earlier because of that. But at the higher intensities, where that tension's going to be higher, where that power output's going to be higher, it's almost expected. But it's interesting to see that change. And if we kept going for 4 weeks, would we see that start even further back? And would that then become a limiter and disrupt performance and negate it almost?
If I remember rightly, wasn't that my issue? My issue was similar with yours, wasn't it? It was like, it's that swelling essentially, and I never got to that toe because I couldn't deal with that pump essentially. Whereas Ash had a better utilization, so it was because I was able to recover quicker, wasn't I? I can't remember my exact things, but I remember I was opposite to Ash basically. So
yeah, it was one of those where like the tension from yours. Just blood would pool at the muscle. And so as soon as it was released in the rest period, sweet, flushed all the way, fantastic, can go again. But yeah, whilst under that swelling, that pump, that reduced the power there. So
that's really cool. It's like a mechanism to explain the trade-off basically between power and efficiency. So if you put out too much power too soon, you're actually hurting your ability to endure. What have you seen in endurance athletes on this front, Luke? Have you done many people who do long duration?
Yes, and it's one of those where with an endurance athlete, it'll always be a test carried out on their preferred modality, right? So if it's a runner, it's going to be on a treadmill. If they're a cyclist, it's probably going to be on a bike. If they're a triathlete, we'll try and do everything, but obviously you can't wear a mask in a swimming pool. But for that, it has been consumption is fantastic, delivery is really good, and they look pretty similar, I guess, to yourself in the first test when we first tested you, where there's always plenty of oxygen at the muscle, which makes a lot of sense when we think about A, the needs for endurance training, and B, the type of training and what that brings. Because obviously if you're doing a lot of long, low and slow zone 2 work, you increase in your capillary density as well, so more blood can flow to the muscle, more oxygenated blood there, and stroke volume of the heart, so that delivery is always going to be nice and solid. So it makes sense, and it's one of those where it's like, if that is where they're at, if their oxygen saturation stays relatively high, we don't want to change that, because if you're in a race and your muscles are struggling for oxygen, that's not a good place to be. No. But if we did see that they, for whatever reason, at the higher intensities did desaturate, if we saw those occlusion trends, it would be a case of trying to improve on that and increase kind of blood flow and delivery all the way through there.
Amazing. And what sort of sessions or nutrition would you put in place to do something like that? Is that...
So nutrition's an interesting one. It's always going to be a case of matching the type of training. So for that, as I said, kind of low and slow zone 2 work can obviously improve that. And from a nutrition point of view, there's some techniques that you can employ to almost amplify those adaptations. So training low has been shown to kind of amplify the adaptations from low and slow training, thinking about kind of fat oxidation and improving that aspect as well, and improving capillary density, mitochondrial biogenesis, all of that good stuff, right? Nutrition wise as well, for acute interventions, potentially nitrates can be beneficial there. So from kind of 2 points of view, number one, a vasodilator. So if they can increase that area of the blood vessels and increase that blood flow, then happy days, that's going to help. But also nitrates have been shown to reduce the oxygen cost. So it almost becomes less of an issue because you will need less oxygen. So if that supply is a little worse, then you can almost get over it. But again, that's one where you're not necessarily fixing the limiter, you're compensating for it in a way. But the vasodilation might help with that too.
Awesome. Great. So quick summary of the results. Basically, the amount of air I was actually bringing in was slightly less than before, but my performance on the bike was better because the air that I was bringing in, I could make much greater use. I was using 74% of it. You could think of it one way versus 48% in the first test. So the fuel tank wasn't bigger. I was just making better use of what I actually had, which is quite cool because it's exactly the intervention that we, or the adaptation that we sought to achieve over the month. So yeah, on first glance, I was a bit gutted that my VO2 didn't go up. But then actually when we went through the granular detail and the fact that my performance went up is really what matters. And I think that's probably one of the key takeaways that we want for the listeners is to focus on the metric that matters. Ultimately, no one wins any competitions or any medals for their VO2 max. They win for their performance. And VO2 max is just one metric that feeds into how we can explain somebody's performance. So if we get over obsessed with VO2 max, we kind of don't see the wood for the trees. And focusing on the performance and what aspect of your physiology is holding back your performance, I think is a really important mindset to have as an athlete and a coach, to get the most out of your training and nutrition.
So Ash, what over this month do you think do you think you gave it everything to get the best result, or do you think there was any like limitations to this month that have hindered your results, shall we say, just so we can give the listeners a really transparent understanding of why your VO2 may not have also increased? Yes, your saturation did, but
yeah, I see what you're getting at, mate. You're testing my scientific rigor, and I think it's important that we describe all the potential explanatory variables. And for me, August was quite a boozy month. I basically had some big social
You drink?
things, and every now and then, mate, I have one or two. So but every weekend in August, basically, I had something going on. So on that front, that was atypical, especially compared to COVID times. Because I was doing the assault bike stuff and I was very busy work-wise, I actually did less other cardio. So I would normally do a little bit more running, and I didn't have a single squash match, which is another form of cardio that I would do semi-regularly, and less training overall, I would say. And other than that, I think, just generally a little bit less healthy than I normally would be. There is one thing I didn't disclose to Luke. I managed to secure some PEDs from America, from the New York Bagel Company, and I was smashing a couple of extra bagels just because I fancied them. And that might be the real reason that like drinking alcohol and having extra bagels is really what improved my performance, but we can't be sure. So.
And I think what's funny is because it's like, even though these are maybe not ideal for a test month, it's just reality. And this is, I think, a lot of the time that unless you're an elite athlete, it's very unlikely you're going to have a perfect month. And but it's not allowing those like dodgy weekends to then affect the rest of your week's training or the rest of your week's eating. Because I know, even from personal experience, I have a bit of a heavy, say, Friday or Saturday or both. Sunday's a bit crap, and then Monday I feel a little bit laggy, and it might impact, and it then just goes through to the end of the week, and then the next thing you know, you're at the next weekend. And it's like, I think this is what's so important is, even with those variables in your month, you were still able to bring it back and still have the goal in mind and the focus of achieving your sessions, getting your beta-alanine in, and and overall, I guess recovering right to give yourself the best chance. So
yeah, I think the reality of the situation, like you say, is that we can't be super scientific. Like if we were to get really pedantic about running an experiment, we probably would have done one variable at a time. Whereas in this, there are really three interventions at play. There's the beta-alanine, there's the desaturation session, and then there's the lactate retention session. And we can't be 100% sure which one of the three is most responsible for the improvement. But because we have a hypothesis around the mechanisms and the fact that they all play into the same overall story, we have learned something really significant because we've achieved the effect that we set out to. You can always go down the correlation versus causation line of discussion, but with a good hypothesis and testing and retesting to see if what we think was going to happen happened, we can be reasonably sure. And this isn't something that's going to get peer reviewed and published, but anecdotally, I've learned a lot about my own body and my performance has improved, which is ultimately what we care about.
Beautiful. So, Ash, do you want to do another 4 weeks? Would you do this again?
If the price is right. I'm in no rush to spend 13 minutes a week again on the assault bike. I think it did take away from other training slightly just because it is so draining. I did really enjoy it, to be fair, and I'm glad I did it. But I think my energy could be better spent if there's nothing to learn. Once we've learnt it, then I'm happy to move on.
Yeah, well, we've learnt it and we've taken it up as well, right? So you'd get less bang for your buck out of it as well, right?
Exactly.
That's true.
Exactly. So I think to sort of wrap it up, some of the key takeaways we want out of this episode. One, on a quite specific point, cardiovascular exercise is multifaceted. So if you are interested in your cardio performance, whether it's for CrossFit or for a pure endurance sport, it's not as simple as just doing that thing. The more granular you can get in discovering your limiter, the more effective your training can be. So the classic training programs try to cover all bases, but I think one of the learning points from this experiment is that if you target your limiter with actually quite a small amount of targeted effort, you can make a significant improvement in your overall performance. Because for me, if I'd spent this month working on my low and slow, improving my oxygen in, that might not necessarily have improved my performance as much because that wasn't actually holding back how much I put out on the bike. Sure, if I had a bigger tank and I still used 48% of it, then my performance you'd expect to go up. But actually, with the really targeted work to make use of what I was already bringing in, we saw a good improvement in performance from not actually very much training overall. I think the other point that we touched on earlier was making sure that you pick the metrics that matter. So performance on the assault bike is actually the real world output that we're worried about. So Vo2 Max and desaturation and blood flow all just play into the narrative around how we explain that performance and how we might look to improve it. And the scientific rigor of assessing and then retesting at periodic points along the way to check that whatever intervention or training plan you've got in place is working is I think a key way to approach everything if you're looking to make improvements in performance, whether it's cardio, strength, or otherwise. Having some sort of evaluation of progress at regular points along the way is key.
I think what's going to be really interesting is because obviously you're not someone who necessarily uses the assault bike. It's not really your thing per se, week in, week out, really. But I wonder now how this improves your football, how it improves your squash. Just the fact that you can take your muscles down to a lower level, so you essentially can work harder for longer. So it'd be really interesting to now see over the next month your newbie gains, how you can use this. And then if you feel that you feel this limiter, then maybe you could bring in that assault bike session again, that 30 cows one, and just once a week, because then you're thinking, cool, okay, by just doing this, or maybe the other one, the 1 minute on, 1 minute off one, is in doing that because you know that's going to help with your outside the gym performances, which is what you really care about, really. So I think what's been really fascinating about this is you've found a bit of kit to give you the stimulus needed, even though that bit of kit isn't what you necessarily need to get better at. You've just used a tool to achieve that. So then I'll be really intrigued to maybe just over the next month, while you're maybe still got these newbie gains, to see, hopefully, if you get some more squash in or if you get some football, how you feel.
I've had a couple of squash matches this week actually, and
there we go.
Fitness definitely wasn't my limiter. I felt fit, and I was actually playing against two sort of middle-aged guys who were very wily and experienced. So I think they recognized my fitness advantage and were pulling out all the tricks, like long breaks between points, between games, just like dropping their racket at points like that, or like instead of picking up the ball, they'll flick it accidentally to the other end of the court to just slow the game down. So they managed to neutralize the fitness advantage to some extent. But I felt great. I felt really fit, and it didn't take much out. Like one of them was a 5-setter, and compared to I think how I would have felt before, I felt like it didn't really deplete me as much as it might do normally, and at no point were my legs burning, even in the long rallies. So I definitely feel fit at the moment.
Amazing.
Subjectively.
Yeah. So Luke, just thank you, mate. Not only obviously for putting Ash through this torture and for us to now being able to discuss it and understand it, but also thank you for all the episodes you've obviously come on so far to discuss all these different topics. And, can you tell us a bit more whether maybe the listeners might be able to find out more and maybe get their own one done and then book in their retest and so forth?
Of course, yeah. Well, thanks for having me. First of all, it's always a pleasure to talk to you guys. But yeah, for any more information on this side of thing, the PH Nutrition website is the place to go for that. So that's where you can book in a test. There's a couple of blogs on there as well about previous tests, case studies, and then obviously the nutrition side of things. So a ton of things on there, including my very own engine nutrition program, which has been designed basically across 2 phases to attack kind of everything that we talked about, really, in terms of taking up your capacity and tailoring it to the right situation and the right intervention there too. And then also, if you want to reach out to me and get in touch, terrible name on Instagram, at Hallmighty1, which is a pun that followed me from high school. But yeah, at Hallmighty1, and then the PH Nutrition Instagram and PH Nutrition website as well.
Beautiful, mate. Luke, all the links will be in the bio description down below. But have you not thought about changing that Instagram, or you really do like it deep down?
I think, yeah, it's one of those where I thought it was so funny when I was younger that I may as well just keep it. And someone even said to me the other day, but that is now how you are associated to people. You can't change it now because they won't know who you are.
I love it. So cheers, mate. Thank you very much for your time. And we'll speak to you soon. I mean, what an episode that was, right, Ash? I loved it. It's really interesting to hear that not only are you human like most of us, but, to also get some insight into what targeted training and how the improvements aren't always as obvious as initially thought. So really, really fascinating to dig deep into that. Really hope you got some stuff out of it. And as Luke mentioned there at the end, if you do want to know more, all in the description box will be all his contact details, so you can find out more either about him or about the service that PH Nutrition offer. But as always, thank you very much for listening. We really do appreciate your ears, and we appreciate your eyes if you are over on YouTube. If you want to support the podcast, we would love it if you would just head over to YouTube and start building up our subscription base. Obviously, that is going to help us not only grow, but also then hopefully eventually start monetizing this. And that's the honest truth. It's quite an expensive thing to do as a hobby. But yeah, if you do want to support us, it's a nice free thing. Head over to YouTube, press subscribe, and get some more eyes on us. But thank you as always. If you do want to also support us a little bit more, you can leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. That really does help us there as well. We're trying to get into the top 200 fitness podcasts. Might be a while, but we're on the journey. Don't know where we are because I can't actually see outside 200. But thank you very much for your time, and we will see you next week.
Thanks, guys.